to the fourth in the series of our architecture and philosophy sessions. And this one is going to be about Henri Bergson, someone that I would say, not that knowledgeable. I'm going to be much more of a kind of student today. This is, of course, along with a series where we've already covered Siegfried Kracauer, Homi Bhabha, Bruno Latour. And next week, we have Heidi Hazone and Robert Gorney talking about Donna Haraway, and then followed by Susanna Kova talking about Julia Kristeva. And I should point out the session on Julia Kristeva is going to be in the evening from the States, because she's based in Australia. So Susanna's based in Australia, so it'll be slightly out of sync, so rather difficult for our colleagues in Europe. And then finally, Luis Lorenza Corna and Pippo Chiora on Manfredo Tafori, and that proves to be an interesting end to the series. So just to say briefly, we are uploading these sessions onto our YouTube account. Everything is uploaded down there. If you sign up for the Digital Futures thing, you will get reminded every time every new post is made. And I also, if you're interested in Instagram, Digital Futures World, and my own Instagram, Nearly14, will give you updates, regular updates of the sessions that we're going to have. So just to say, just very, very briefly on Henri Bergson, because I'm going to leave it to the two experts here. Henri Bergson, his dates are 1859 to 1941, and he's a very interesting character in the sense that he appeals both to the continental tradition and also to the analytic tradition. And even more unusual, perhaps, for him is he's the only philosopher I know who's received the Nobel Prize for Literature back in 1927. Deleuze was fascinated by him and wrote a book on him. To characterize him broadly, he's part of the process philosophy team, though interested in issues such as becoming and change and novelty, to be contrasted to, for example, the other approach, which looks at being, permanence, and uniformity. And we can see that someone like O is part of the enemy, as it were, that still survives in places like Sark for some reason. I don't know why. But anyway, he's part of the process philosophies series with Alfred North Whitehead and Gibson and Deleuze and so on. So today we have the distinct pleasure of having Andrej Radman and Stavros Kousoulas back from the Architecture, Philosophy and Theory group at TU Delft, one of the most, I think, advanced theory departments in any university in the world. So it's a great privilege to have the two here. And I'm going to literally just hand over to first of all to Stavros and then to Andrej. So please, let me just stop sharing my screen and yeah.
Yes, thank you, Neil. You're very kind, as usual. Perhaps too kind. Let me share my screen as well, and we go. Yeah, we have prepared already that I will give you the first shot, and then Andrej will take over, and we're going to last approximately 45 minutes each, and then we will open it to a discussion. I suppose you can see the screen being shared, right? Yeah, okay. We also agreed with Andrej. I'm going to give two anecdotes that have to do with Bergson, and it's kind of like breaking the ice moment. And the first thing is that in the early 20th century, with even very few cars present, it was Mr. Bergson that caused the first ever recorded traffic jam in the New York City. Where people literally were flooding downtown New York to go and see him speak. So Bergson was a very big persona back in the beginning of the 20th century, and he's turned to oblivion for quite a few times, for actually 5 to 6 decades, when he was picked up again by people in what we can call now post-structuralist philosophy of let's say 60s, 70s France. So Deleuze, Simondon, Rouyer, and the rest. It was indeed like a 50 to 60 years hiatus that he went through, and this hiatus originally started from a debate that he had with Einstein, and in that debate he even placed some bets about some stuff, the theory of relativity namely, and he lost them miserably. So he was not very fortunate in how he closed his career, let's say that, and I'm joking about referring to him in terms of careers. But in any case, that's not the point. Today we're going to go purely into the content of what Bergson had to offer to us. Specifically, when I say us, I mean when it comes to architecture thinking and architectural doing. Andrej is going to go in a slightly more, let's say, specific direction about a couple of concepts of Bergson. I'm going to provide a broader overview of one main term, which one would say it's even methodological in its ambition, and that's what Bergson was calling problematization. In there, I'm going to touch very briefly some couple of concepts of Bergson, but mainly it's going to be problematization that I'm interested. And Andrej is going to go into some more detail about some more specific concepts. Andrej, you want to say anything before we start, like introducing or saying hi, or I give it a go?
I just want to second you. We are very happy to be back. By back, I mean we have already contributed a session on Simondon, and I just want to say that in the meantime, my colleague and friend has published this book, which is on technicities on Simondon in architecture. So check it out.
You're better than me in promoting myself. Thank you, Andrej. Thank you, Andrej. And okay, we go straight ahead. So one of the first things that Bergson was claiming that thinking was lacking the most was precision. He was calling it precision. And by precision, what he had in mind was a reliable method that could express precisely knowledge about reality. And according to him, the most commonsensical modes of thinking, they're simply too wide for reality. And therefore making propositions and advancing statements about this reality that could also hold true for a world or universe that is radically different than the one we do occupy. So in his own words, this mode of thinking, which, by the way, we can classify it as transcendental reductionist generalizing mode of thinking, operates in terms that could equally well apply to a world in which neither plants nor animals have an existence, only men, and in which men would quite possibly do without eating and drinking. They would neither sleep nor dream, nor let their minds wander, and where everything might just as easily go backwards and be upside down. So what he demands from us, Bergson, is a way of thinking that does justice to this reality, and only this reality, to this world, and not another world that could serve the one thinking about it. I would say, therefore, that it would also demand, Bergson, were he an architect, to think and speak about an architecture that is without anything added on it, except its own architectural reality. That has nothing to do with autonomies and stuff like that. We can discuss it later on. Even more, Bergson would add, we should speak about an architecture that is so close to its reality that between architecture and reality, there's nothing really else that could fit. Because the only explanation we should accept as satisfactory is one that fits tightly to its object, with no space between them, no crevice in which any other explanation might equally well be lodged. One which fits the object only, and to which alone the object lends itself. To further understand this point, it's worth looking at Bergson's critique of the notion of the possible, and Andrej is going to go into more detail later on about it. According to him, the notion of the possible is only the real with the addition of an act of the mind that throws its image back into the past once it has been exacted. So in other words, we arrive at the possible by starting from reality, from the real, from what already exists. And we take something from this existence, project its image backwards, and only in the end claim that it existed first as a possibility realized now in the real. So this process of reverse realization, this process of constituting the possible, is always subjected to the rule of resemblance, to how things look like. The real is supposed to resemble the possible, to be made in its image, the same way that God and his disciple Adam touch one another. As Bergson asks, if the real is supposed to resemble the possible, it is not because we have retrospectively or retroactively projected a fictitious image of the real back into the possible. Any typological thinking within architecture is precisely that. It's never the real that resembles the possible, it's the possible that's always formed in the image of what already exists. Therefore, the possible as a concept, and that's the starting point for Simondon to speak against it in order to introduce something that's much more precise, is a purely negative concept, the possible. A negation of reality.
Bergson, not Simondon, Bergson.
I said Simondon, sorry. I mean, you see, I'm obsessed with Simondon. So Bergson, of course, Bergson. The possible, according to Bergson, it's a purely negative concept, a negation of reality that it's supposed to give birth to. How about a positive concept then? A positive concept that could speak about processes of realization. How about a concept that does not wish to make the world conform to its restriction or to the replication of what already exists, but rather wishes to speak of how something new is born, how something novel is produced, how something that does not resemble anything comes forward. To approach the problem of the new, one must complete the 4 following steps. And in this one, I'm following Sanford Quinter. By the way, you will see that my Bergson, and I think also Andrej, is a slightly bastardized Bergson. So that's a common approach to people that we love. So what Quinter is suggesting to us is that to speak of novelty in architecture, we should redefine the traditional understanding of the object. We should reintroduce and radicalize a theory of time. We should conceive movement as a first principle and not just a special case. And we should combine all the above in an all-encompassing theory of the event. I will briefly touch all these steps via Bergson, and I will claim what they have in common, what they all presuppose, is a dismissal of the possible and an appraisal of a radically different ontology, a radically different understanding of how things are produced. And exactly on this radically different understanding is where the concept of a virtual, that Andrej is going to go in more detail, I think, that's where the concept of a virtual comes in. To understand what the virtual stands for, we will need to briefly look at how Bergson approaches memory. Again, Andrej will go in detail there. Bergson argues that memory is not just a faded out or less complex version of an experience that once was present. A memory, according to Bergson, is something that is fundamentally and qualitatively distinct from any present experience. For Bergson, the past is a single domain where all previous events, past events, coexist with one another. This domain, says Bergson, is real, though it is virtual rather than actual. At its present moment, time splits in two, into a dynamic actual present that pushes towards a future, and a memory of that present, a virtual double of this present moment, that immediately forms part of this single domain of all past events. According to him, when we try to remember something, we leap into this virtual past as if we're entering a different medium. And once we find that memory that we were looking for, we bring it into the present, usually in such a way that this memory fits our current actual purposes and activities. This was as much in detail as I'm going to go to issues of memory and virtual from Bergson. But it's exactly this initial understanding of a virtual by Bergson that another philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, picks up and enhances, placing it in a much broader and more comprehensive ontological system. To explain what the virtual is, in the sense that we understand it more commonly nowadays after it has been appropriated and spread by Deleuze's understanding of Bergson's virtuality, it's easier to actually start saying what it is not, to describe what the virtual is not. So the virtual, it is fully real, but it's not actual. So there is an opposition between the virtual and the actual now. It comes before the actual, at least conceptually, but it does not resemble it or prefigure it. There's not one-to-one relationship between the two. The virtual, therefore, is not the possible. It's not a matter of one image resembling a supposed, let's say, foundational image. Neither is the virtual appropriate to speak about it straightforwardly, directly, as just potential. It needs slightly more delicate handling. So the virtual is real without being actual, in the same way that a wooden desk has the capacity, a wooden desk like the one we're sitting, most of us now, has the capacity to burn, to splinter, to expand, to crack. And all these capacities are there, but they're not happening, all of them simultaneously or all the time. So before we put it into fire, the desk has the capacity to burn, and it exists as a capacity in an unexercised form. So these capacities, which we can call the virtual in that sense, again, very simplistically, these capacities of a desk are better described not as existing, but as insisting. They insist. They are not currently actual, but in different conditions, they tend towards actualization. They insist. So capacities exist as if on a spectrum of insistence. Submerged in the water, let's say if you push it in the bottom of a lake, the desk's capacity to catch fire is especially far away from becoming actual. Its capacities, however, to expand, to warp, and eventually decay are, on the other hand, a lot nearer actualization. So capacities have a certain gradient in there. The virtual is not, therefore, a simple inverse of the actual. One reaches the level of virtuality neither by depriving the actual of its reality, nor but by subtracting it from its concrete existence. The virtual, in a positive manner now, is defined as a differential field, a field of differences, which have dispositions and these dispositions vary relatively to the specific conditions under which actualization takes place. So this heavy phrase, what does it mean, this heavy phrase, which I know it is indeed heavy? Actually, it's rather simple. The virtual is the field of relations between different and diverse capacities. It's never about one alone. It's always about different and diverse capacities relating with one another. Many of the things I'm referring to now and slightly later on, I'm also picking them up from an excellent text by Ronald Bogue, which is called Search, Swim, and See. And it is about Deleuze's understanding of problematization and Bergson. So, again, the virtual is a field of relations between different and diverse capacities. Take, for example, the virtuality of you reading a book, okay? The virtuality of you reading a book is formed by, first of all, you being literate in a sufficient degree, having access to necessary sources, the book, a desk, a chair, having free time, having an interest in that kind of literature specifically, and so on. All these different capacities, in their coming together, they constitute, and wait for it, that's where my title comes into place now, they constitute a problematic field. That's how Bergson and therefore also Deleuze later was approaching it. A problematic field that its resolution or actualization might be, in certain conditions, you reading that book. So this field on its own neither prefigures the actual state of how would you read the book, nor it leads to it as if by necessity. And this is the key to virtuality. Problems and their solutions co-emerge in a single movement. In other words, processes of actualization structure the problematic field the same moment they attempt to resolve it. It's a chicken and an egg co-constitutive condition. And it's this re-evaluation of problems and the field they form, especially within architectural thinking and doing, but also in relation to our broader educational practices, that I will focus on for the remainder of this lecture. To go to really highlight problematization as, according to me, the way of thinking that should be promoted in architectural thinking, I will also need a couple of more Bergsonian notes in there. So Bergson will point exactly to the fallacy of thinking that the possible leads to, and it not being allowed to be precise about reality, by claiming that it showcases a fundamental disrespect about time, first and foremost. Remember the 4 points I mentioned earlier. It's the first point I'm going to address, time. Put simply, the only interest that it has, the way of thinking that it's generalizing and thinks on typologies and possibilities, it's seeking the truth in the things that do not change, in positioning therefore itself outside of time, because as we know, things in time do change. So close to the masters that remain distant of the workshop. Transcendental generalizing thinking is one of inputs and outputs, precisely because those two, the input and the output, are without any temporal dimension when the one transforms to the other. They are static terms that never change. For Bergson, the greatest change of all, the greatest difference of all, is actually temporal difference, and as he would call it, is the difference of how something differs from itself. To understand why is it important to follow Bergson, let's see one of his most, in my opinion, beautiful examples. As he writes, one might as well discourse on the subject of the cocoon from which the butterfly is about to emerge, and claim that the fluttering, changing, living butterfly finds its reason of existence and fulfillment in the immutability of its cell. On the contrary, let's unfasten the cocoon, awaken the chrysalis. Let's restore to movement mobility, change fluidity, to time its duration, and that's the key word here, duration. Who knows but what the great insoluble problems will remain attached to the outer cell? They were not concerned with either movement or change or time, but only with a conceptual cocoon which we mistakenly took for them or for their equivalent. Metaphysics will then become experience itself, and duration will be revealed for what it really is. Unstopping creation, uninterrupted upsurge of novelty. Again, the key word here is duration from Bergson. And this is what any generalizing thinking, typological, resemblance-based thinking is lacking. And exactly duration is what can provide precision to thinking. Bergson claims that in his conclusions on the importance of duration led him to develop a method that would approach reality with precision. He will somewhat provocatively, this method is called, let's say, generally speaking, problematization, but provocatively this particular characteristic of thinking in temporal terms, of thinking in temporal terms when problematizing. He will call it intuition. Okay, so thinking in terms of duration and time is thinking intuitively, according to Bergson. And he will also be even more provocative, and that's one of it. It's also, I mean, different discussion, but it stands also at the core of his beefs with various scientists, including Einstein on the time. This approach of Bergson towards intuition. He's actually saying that the intuitive way of problematizing is actually a mode of knowing which is distinct from intelligence. So Bergson was going against the conceptual, let's say the conceptual commonplace understanding we might have about intelligence. If we bring that closer to architectural thinking and doing, intuition is a mode of knowledge that should not be confused with instincts or feelings, has nothing to do with them. And actually what it stands for, it's thinking in terms of duration, in terms of internal differences. This is the case precisely, I will explain why it has to do with internal difference, but it's the case precisely because intuition does not start from the static and immobile in order to explain that which is always transforming, but quite the contrary, it starts from movement and considers immobility as just an abstraction of movement. When we speak about internal differences, just to clarify that, because I'm not sure if I give this lecture sometimes also in the classroom, and always I give it in a 2-hour-long, let's say, duration of its own right, where I don't really think about time and I just go and give examples always. But when we speak about internal differences and to understand why duration has to do with internal difference, it has to do with internal difference because the same way that in order to understand the developmental mode of someone, let's say even me and Andrej, even we belong to the same so-called species, it wouldn't make sense to compare a picture of Andrej at 40 years old and a picture of me at 2 years old. You wouldn't really understand something in there. You would get much more about the developmental particularities of an individual if you were to start comparing, let's say, comparing him or her with himself or herself continuously through time. So how someone differs from themselves can reveal much more about a certain developmental trajectory rather than comparing statically snapshots of even externally different things. Okay, that's why duration is connected with internal difference, and that's why Bergson is claiming that internal difference is actually the thing that highlights intuitively the developmental mode of something, how something individuates. Okay, as a method in its own right, this way of thinking in internal differences of individuals in their individuation, I'm using Simondonian terms also, it's a method itself, intuition, that needs to constantly experiment. For Bergson, the goal of this experimental way of thinking, of intuitively problematizing the world, is actually aiming towards a concrete mode of knowledge, a third kind of knowledge, if I would put Spinoza from the window. And it's going there not by way of the abstract, as it's customary in many metaphysics, but it's actually going there by leaving the abstract aside and engaging in a sustained and continuous interaction and connection with the concrete, since it's only via this latter concrete route that a tighter fit between object and explanation can be achieved. That's what he calls as metaphysical precision. Okay, to bring thought back in this reality, one that it's both individuating, full of eternal differences, changing all the time, Bergson wonders how much more instructive it would be a truly intuitive metaphysics which would follow the undulations of the real. True, it would not embrace in a single sweep the totality of things, but for each thing it would give an explanation which would fit it exactly and it alone. It would not begin by defining or describing the systematic unity of a world, because who knows if a world is actually one. Experience alone can say in unity, if it exists, it will appear at the end of the search as a result. It's impossible to posit it at the start as a principle. Furthermore, it will be a rich, full unity, the unity of a continuity, the unity of our reality, and not an abstract and empty unity, which has come from a supreme generalization, and which could as well be that of any possible world whatsoever. It's true that philosophy then will demand a new effort for its new problem. No solution will be geometrically deduced from one another. No important truth will be achieved by the prolongation of an already existing and acquired truth. Deploying intuition, and the quote ends there, deploying intuition in order to grasp reality in its movement and in its duration, in its internal differences, implies, therefore, that this reality should be approached and understood problematically. In other terms, and connected to what we were referring before, it means that this reality should be approached and understood in its virtuality, in its field of different and diverse potentials and capacities, and how this field is resolved. Moreover, as Bergson clarifies, for each new problem, there should be a new intuitive effort to approach it. Because intuition, and there I'm going to put Masumi in the game a bit, intuition, because I like particularly the way that he describes intuition with his also particular Masumian phrasing, intuition is nothing else but a thinking feeling. It's not feeling something, feeling thought as such, in its movement as process, on arrival as yet unthought, out and unenacted, post-instrumental and pre-operative, suspended, looked out, insensibly and still, outside any given thing, outside any given sense, outside actuality, outside coming in, the mutual envelopment of thought and sensation as they arrive together, pre what they will have become, just beginning to unfold from the unfelt and the unthinkable outside. Process, transformation in itself. That's how Masumi describes intuition. Intuition, therefore, in my much simpler terms, is actually being able to feel the virtual, to feel that virtual field, that problematic field. Even better and closer to the topic of my lecture today, intuition is actually being able to feel a problem. When one is able to feel a problem, one is thinking and acting intuitively. Bergson would add that intuition is capable of being precise because it is obscure. I know this sounds obscure, but I'm going to explain it. He proposes that when an idea is supposed to be clear, it's often because it merely draws on elements and propositions that are already known and familiar. In other words, clear ideas do nothing more than just rearrange already established notions. And on the contrary, there lies a much more profound clarity in the radically new and absolutely simple idea, which catches, as it were, an intuition. Obscure, complex, and incomprehensible as they may appear, genuinely novel, intuitive ideas that do not rely on simply rearranging the established have as an effect a clearing out of obscurities, a resolution of problematic fields. They are clear, therefore, on the basis of the effects that they have and not on their initial composition of theirs. They become understandable only because they manage to redetermine how we understand what we understand. In simple terms, obscure intuitive ideas forces us to think. And by forcing us to think, we gain, let's say, we gain property, we gain stock of having them clarified by our thinking process. While when something is clear from the get-go, it does not force us to think. And therefore it leaves, let's say, going here and say exiting out there, it leaves nothing unchanged in its passing. Consequently, intuition becomes for Bergson almost synonymous with invention. A peculiar invention, however, since it relies on an absolute origin and not on anything that is given in advance. As Bergson claims, a speculative problem is solved as soon as it's properly stated. By that, I mean that its solution exists then, although it may remain hidden and, so to speak, covered up. The only thing left to do is simply to uncover it. By stating that the problem is not simply uncovering, it's actually inventing. Discovery or uncovering had to do with what already exists, actually, or virtually. It was therefore certain to happen sooner or later. Invention gives being to what actually did not exist. It might never have happened. For Bergson, therefore, to state a problem is actually to invent a problem. However, and that's where I'm going to focus for the remaining part, how one can be sure that the invented problem has actually a truly transformative potential? How can one be sure that out of obscure intuitions, an effect of clarification might emerge? In other words, how can one be sure that what is actually being invented is indeed a true, proper problem? To respond to that question, one needs first to reconsider the relationship between problems and solutions. What often happens is that we act as if problems are given ready-made already, and that they disappear in the responses or the solution that we provide for them. This attitude, which accounts for what Deleuze was calling a dogmatic way of thinking, is an attitude where isolated examples are taken out of context and they're erected into models and principles, rules to be followed, or even worse, within, let's say, educational setups, where a supposed master sets the problem in advance, and then our tasks become simply to resolve them, to solve them properly. The result later on being accredited true or false by the same previous powerful authority. This attitude, according to Bergson, is an attitude that needs to be reversed. Not only because problems are invented and discovered, but also because they produce the conditions under which their solutions might be judged true or false. There's no eternal immutable truth and no eternal immutable error, let's call it like that, falsehood. Its problem is at once both the side of an originary truth and the genesis of a derived truth. Problems are truth-making, that's what I'm saying in simple terms. As such, and we will see how, problems must be evaluated not according to their resolvability, but according to their importance, according to how interesting they are. Their ability, therefore, to generate new questions and the solutions related to those questions. Under the dominance, however, of prioritizing solutions, which is what we do continuously, unfortunately, especially in architectural schools, under the dominance of prioritizing solutions, under the reign of problem-solving supposed attitudes, problems are demonized. They become synonyms of things that are wrong, negative conditions that we must correct, difficult moments that we need to overcome in order to advance. And it's this assumption that results into problems being reduced to negative states, awaiting solutions, and therefore animating a technocratic attitude, associating the very activity of thought, especially within educational frameworks, with that search for solutions, and even worse, with evaluating answers and solutions being just a matter of adequacy, a supposed truth and falsehood of proper responses. However, and that's again where Deleuze enters and transforms partially Bergson, Deleuze would claim that it's never solutions that are true or false. And on the contrary, thought makes mistakes, thought errs, when it poses false problems as if they were supposed true, interesting, important problems. Because, Deleuze continues, who would say good morning Theodorus when theaters passes, let's say John and Paul instead of these ancient Greek names? Who would say it's 3 o'clock when it's 3:30? And who would say that 7 and 5 make 13? These are all effective examples of errors, but examples which, like the majority of such facts, refer to thorough artificial and puerile, sterile situations, and offer a really grotesque image of thought because they relate it to very simple questions to which one can and must respond by independent propositions. Error has a certain sense only once the play of thought stops being speculative and becomes kind of a who wants to be a millionaire. That's where error actually exists. Error does not exist in proper thinking. Therefore, once we no longer bother with questions that simply demanded a demonstration of propositional knowledge that we have covered in our backpacks, once we move beyond the fixed responses to quiz questions, then the duty of thought becomes actually to be able to determine problems that necessarily can transform thought itself. As such, learning, and learning how to do that, becomes much more important than knowledge itself. There is a profound difference between learning, which is the knowing how, and knowledge, which corresponds to the accumulation and memorization of knowing that propositions. We shouldn't care about knowing that propositions as much as we do. I'm not saying not at all, but not as much as we do. Because, as any teacher would confirm, errors or falsehoods are rarely found in homework, except in those exercises where a fixed result must be produced or propositions must be translated one by one. What is more frequently found, and it's much more devastating, are nonsensical sentences, remarks without interest or importance, banalities mistaken for profundities, ordinary points confused with singular points, badly posed or distorted problems, all heave with dangers, and yet they're the fate of us all. Learning, therefore, is the appropriate name for the subjective acts and efforts carried out when one is confronted with the objectivity of a problem, whereas knowledge designates only the generality of concepts or the calm possession of rule-enabling solutions. Learning and problems belong to the domain of the virtual, whereas knowledge and solutions belong to the domain of the actual, of the already existing. In other words, Learning is a matter of opening thought to the virtual domain of problems, which has its own autonomous existence. Learning is not a matter of solving specific questions and securing a permanent body of knowledge. Martin Savransky has some excellent texts on problematization and learning that I can recommend them later in the chat. One can read about all this in even much more detail. In other words, we need to conquer our problems, we need to reconcile with them. Because if we do not conquer and reconcile with our problems, we remain slaves, so long as we do not control the problems themselves, so long as we do not possess a right to formulate problems, a participation in and the management of problems. For example, we would take for granted this very outdated understanding of architecture as being the primitive hut. That's a problem that it's not just wrongly posed and therefore not singular in its own right, but it's a problem that somehow it is inherited and one dare not even question it, but rather just appropriate it. And that, as a consequence, limits thought itself, limits any speculative, intuitive way of problematizing yet again a virtual, let's say, a virtual problematic field that it's the one of architecture. And that's precisely the technocratic problem-solving attitude and what it excludes. It excludes our participation to a determination of problem, to the determination of the problem. We are not being allowed to pose problems. However, ironically, all of science has never been anything but fundamentally dependent on this capacity, on its capacity, even unwillingly, even when one wouldn't know what they were doing. Scientific, let's say, advantages have occurred because of properly formulated problems. The empirical object of science, including architecture, are above all answers to problems. Even Gaston Bachelard, who claimed the term problematique, it's indeed having this sense of a problem that marks out the true scientific mind. For a scientific mind, all knowledge is an answer to a question. If there has been no question, there can be no scientific knowledge. Nothing is self-evident and nothing is given. No architecture is primitive hut, full stop. Said differently, every solution is as good as the problem that it responds to. Every solution has the problem that it actually deserves. Therefore, it's our whole mindset and our educational frameworks that should shift and change. Instead of treating problems as obstacles that we need to overcome, we need to start wondering, exploring, and finding ways that we might come to desire a problem, to actively look forward a problem, actively stay with a problem, stay with the trouble, as I suppose Heidi and Robert will probably once or twice say next week. No? Yeah, next week, right? Yes, yeah, next week. One cannot respond to a problem that one has not learned how to pose. As such, we also need to disconnect thought itself from the process of finding a supposed truth, a supposed solution that's universal and everlasting. And moreover, we also need to replace the common image of philosophy as a gathering of truth seekers, friends of truth who voluntarily exercise a natural tendency for the truth in the form of a dialogue based on infinite what is essentialist questions about the essence of a similarly infinite amount of things. But if we are to replace this image, which, by the way, even Newton, with his laws, he was not just voluntarily coming with the laws of gravity, for example, he had an encounter with something, an encounter with a falling apple, okay? So what should we replace this voluntary image, let's say, of a figure that just sits and has ideas coming to herself or himself? To begin with, we should say that thinking, and especially thinking intuitively and problematizing, is not voluntary. On the contrary, something in the world forces us to think. This something is an object not of recognition, but of a fundamental encounter. And what is encountered may be a person, a temple, or a demon. It may be grasped in a range of affective tones, wonder, love, hatred, suffering, but in whichever tone, its primary characteristic is that it can only be sensed. So to confirm that problems do not exist in our heads, but occur in the actual world, but they are genetic forces that produce worlds, it's to make clear that our encounter with them does not happen inside our heads, okay? But rather it's happening in and outside, but it's populated and alive. It's alive and kicking. Full of durations, internal differences, full of virtualities, but can only be sensed and therefore can only be intuited at first. So let's examine something, and I'm nearing the end, to make this clear, because it will also help us understand what I was referring previously as problematic field. An example that Deleuze also used in reference to learning, is that of swimming. How can one and how does one learn to swim? As Deleuze says, to learn to swim is to enter into the universal of the relations that constitute an idea, the idea of the sea in this case, and into their corresponding singularities. In other words, to learn is to immerse oneself in a problem and its system of differential relations. In other words, to learn is to engage with the virtual and its field of relations between different and diverse capacities, as well as the singular points and moments of those capacities. In learning how to swim, the sea is understood as such a problem. The idea of the sea, for example, as Leibniz showed, is a system of liaisons and different relations, differential relations, between particles and singularities corresponding to the degrees of variation among these relations, the totality of the system being incarnated in the real movement of the waves. The problem of the sea, end of quote, the problem of the sea in general, the universal problem of the sea, is that of the differential relationships between dynamically interacting wave particles, and that the problem singular points, the nadir and the apex, let's say, the highs and the lows of differential potential wave functions. Each concrete physical wave is an actualization of one particular set of singular points, and the whole of the sea is an embodiment of a system of differential relations that constitute the very problem of the sea. I'm going to explain it briefly in simple terms, don't worry. Deleuze continues by saying that to learn to swim is to bring together the singular points of our bodies with the singular points of the objective idea, the sea, in order to form a problematic field between bodies and sea. Through contact with the sea, then, the singular points which are incarnate in the swimmer body are conjoined with the singular points embodied in the sea, and the complex, the whole complex now of singular points belonging to swimmer and sea together form a virtual problematic field. If I was in the classroom, I would write that down in the board, the whiteboard or blackboard. But just to figure what I'm saying is that the difference between how intense a wave is, if you see, let's say, my hand moving, is a difference between a singular point up and a singular point low. If they're nearby each other, the singular points, the lower and the up, it means that the sea is basically without any kind of waves. It's still. If the difference between a lower and an upper point is big, these two singular points is big, then it means that the sea is wavy. When one is swimming in the open sea, one is actually learning intuitively to figure out how can they relate their body with these singular points and their relationship that they have picked up. Differently you swim when it's like this, differently you swim when it's like that, the differential between the two singular points. This coming together of singular points determines for us a threshold of consciousness at which our real acts are adjusted, so we adjust ourselves, to our perceptions of this relation, thereby providing a solution, my particular way of swimming, in the problem of this particular state of the sea. Now, how this coming together of singular points is done, thank God, is extremely open, how they're coming together and how we perceive it. It's actually extremely open so much to literally an infinite number of ways and manners. In other words, how each one of us relates to the singular points that one is able to pick up, and therefore how one can determine a problematic field as well as the solution that can emerge out of it, is extremely fundamentally open and creative. Okay? In simple terms, producing and resolving a problematic field based on the singular problematic points we picked up is always a matter of style. That's why all of us, even now, we are in different rooms. We all resolve the virtual problematic field of inhabiting a room, making it in our own, in a different way. We all have our own style on resolving a problem. This means that there is a creative gap between the virtual and the actual, between the problem and its solution. As another example in that, and I'm gonna be faster, Andrej, I have like 5 more minutes left, okay? As another example that will help clarify this, the difference, for example, between an education system and a prison complex, okay? Both are two different actualizations of disciplinary virtuality, two different solutions, actually, to the problem of disciplining individuals. There is nothing that looks like a prison in the virtual problem of discipline. There is nothing also that looks like a school. Instead, the problem contains only the relations and singularities into which a human population to be controlled is put. Corporeal distance, succession of exercises, precision of movement, degree of obedience to various commands, and so on. This I'm picking up from a great book of John Protevi, where he also goes partially at some points in Bergson and his problematization. So the prison actualizes these elements in terms of a high degree of control, intolerance for defiance, systematically regimented schedule, restriction of bodies to cells and small rooms, and so on. While a school, the same disciplinary problem, actualizes it with a lower degree of intensity of control. Bodies are still restricted to specific spaces, but not as small and constrained. Movement is still regulated. Obedience is still expected, but defiance, when you try to break those rules, is met with a difference in grade. Let's say you get a bad grade, or you get a note for your parents, a note to take back home. In any case, you don't go into solitary confinement or corporeal punishment, at least not nowadays, or so we would hope. So what both solutions, prison and school, what they both share is that they're produced from a single, one and the same problem, the problem of disciplining, okay? And to understand that, to understand how they both meet one another in the problem of discipline, to grasp it, we first need to be able to feel, sense, and determine that problem, the problem of discipline, properly. There have been so many things, so many solutions that go unnoticed for their virtual proximities, for the field of differential capacities that they have been produced of and that they themselves bring forward. And we would be unable to feel any of them, to see, sense, grasp any of them, as long as we are not able to go back to the very problem that determines them. It's only through an involuntary confrontation with something other than thought itself that we can engage difference. And that which provokes the encounter with something other than thought is actually, and I'm wrapping it up, a sign. A sign, to avoid a very long discussion on science now, I don't know if Andrej is going to go there, but we could perhaps go in the discussion, is simply the expression of crossing a threshold. When you see the sea, the singular points being equal, or when you see them being in such a great difference where you understand that the sea is wavy, that difference is actually a sign, is actually a threshold that has been crossed. The sign is the expression of crossing a limit. Signs are always relative to the meaning that they carry for the one perceiving them, depending on the situation that one finds themselves in. Preparing to get out of your home in the morning, the sound of drops in the ceiling is a sign that it will rain. And you pick this up, it informs you, it has meaning for you, because you will need to act accordingly to protect yourself from the rain, to resolve the problematic field between your body and the rain. That's where an umbrella comes in. Swimming in the sea, you register the sound of the water, the drift of the current, the distance from the shore, because you find yourself in the process of resolving the problematic field between your body and water. What happens, however, in less obvious cases? In less obvious cases, we need to engage with the field itself directly in order to register the signs that can allow its resolution. We need to experiment with the field. If to learn is to intuitively bring together singular points in order to form a problematic field, then we may say as well that to learn is indeed to constitute this space as a space of an encounter with science. As such, and in this effort, I would like to close by saying that Deleuze was extremely clear and actually extremely accurate by saying that we learn nothing from those who say, do as I do, or our only teachers are those who tell us, do with me, and are able to emit signs to be developed in heterogeneity rather than propose gestures for us to reproduce. So with this last note on the importance of science in the resolution and formulation of problematic fields, I would like to pass the next field onwards to Mr. Radman.
Thank you, Mr. Kousoulas. Thanks. Wonderful. So I will stop. Okay.
And I will totally drink some water because this has been a long monologue.
You deserve it. Thank you. And it was, I think, exactly 45 minutes as you promised. Let me just share my screen. I've seen already in chat people were interested in your references, so eventually maybe it would be good to add them. Do you? I will. I don't see the questions about the references, but I will place them. I will place them there. Yes. Do you see my screen? I mean, is it? Do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Let me just start once again thanking Neil and the whole team for this wonderful opportunity to revisit Bergson. Such a pleasure. And I will start with a disclaimer. I first read Deleuze and only then Bergson. So my reading of Bergson is highly inflected by Deleuze. As we have heard already from Stavros, Bergson was at one point a real superstar, so much so that his American tour, as he already pointed out, caused the very first traffic jam in the history of Broadway. I can't imagine any philosopher today to reach that height. And then he was virtually forgotten, to be resuscitated by Deleuze. I appropriated Deleuze's book title for this talk, and the ism in Bergsonism is to grant myself poetic license. This is to say that my reading is constructivist, as was Stavros's, and not exegetical. So my plan is to introduce three key Bergsonian concepts. The first one is the concept of the virtual. We have already heard how Bergson was critical of the logic of the possible, where the possible is seen as the opposite of the real. Instead, he argued, both the virtual and the actual are real. And this will take roughly 1/2 of the presentation. I will use his famous cone of pure memory to touch on the phenomenon of ChatGPT. Second, the ascetic theory of experience, wonderfully elaborated in Quentin's Mayasu's piece from Collapse 3, with a suggestive title, Subtraction and Contraction. In a nutshell, this subtractive or ascetic theory posits that perception is not the object plus something, but rather the object minus something. That is to say, minus everything that is not of interest. Lastly, I will draw on Anne Sauvignac's Art Machines, wonderful book, to introduce the concept of moving image. According to Bergson, the image is less than a thing and more than a representation. This is a speculative pragmatist or transcendental empiricist position that fits between realism and idealism. So here we go. According to Deleuze, Bergson provides a timely alternative to the tradition of phenomenology or of overcoming Kant. Phenomenology, which effectively started with the critical turn, displaced the classical disjunctive couple of either essences or appearances, the first column that you see here. So the ideal eternal forms versus their imperfect incarnations. And it replaced it by the conjunctive couple of phenomena, that which appears, and the conditions of appearing or apparition. So the conditions of possibilities in general. Kant famously performed a self-proclaimed Copernican turn by making the object turn around the subject. And it is this move, according to Deleuze, that marks the birth of phenomenology. Phenomenology, in all its subsequent variants, thus becomes a philosophy of access, with the transcendental subject as the gatekeeper. This issue of correlationism has been revisited by speculative realism, which appears to have lost its momentum. Yet, it resurfaces in the recent work of Wendy Chan that I strongly recommend. In any case, the formula that emerges is the following. Without a subject, there can be no world. So no subject, no world. Enters Bergson. Deleuze cannot contain his excitement about the audacity of Bergsonism. To him, Bergson is second only to Spinoza, the prince of immanence. While phenomenologists, including the sophisticated ones, such as Merleau-Ponty, view consciousness as always consciousness of something, so serving as an anchor, Bergson argues that consciousness is full stop. What does this mean? It means that Bergson departs from the hylomorphic formula in which an image or matter is dependent on consciousness or form. Phenomenology in this sense remains a theory of enrichment, as it depends on addition, n+1 provided by a priori consciousness. The world would supposedly be utterly unintelligible without the contribution of some sort of schemata, Kantian mental categories that act as ordering devices. Bergsonism, on the other hand, operates by subtraction. There is always more to reality than in perception. The real is not a formless, chaotic swirl onto which structure must be imposed by cognitive processes. So we don't need schemas to pre-structure experience or regulate how something appears to us. In Bergson's view, perception and matter differ only in degree. More on this in the final part. So to recapitulate the three epochs or three logics, the logic of creation, the logic of foundation, and the logic of expression, in relation to the problem of the one and the many. So for the classical period, here appearing on the left, the one is represented by essences and the many by appearances. In phenomenology, the middle column, the one is generic, conditions of possibility, and the many is the phenomena that appear under those conditions. Finally, the third column, Bergsonism, the one and the many are reciprocally determined, as Stavros was already explaining. They are reciprocally determined through the spatial actualization of virtual temporalities or duration, which provides the real, genetic and not generic conditions for the emergence of reality. Please note the radicality of this third column under the banner of new materialism. While the first two are operating under the regime of representation, where the possible looks like the real, the image that Stavros used of the touch. So where the possible looks like the real, the virtual and the actual are isomorphic, but bear no resemblance. What we encounter here is the movement of constraining and expressing, hence expressionism. When Bergson criticizes the possible as a retroactive hypostatization of the real, he is effectively flagging a case of Alfred North Whitehead's fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Just to remind ourselves, hypostatization is the act of treating something abstract as if it were a concrete material thing. The retroactive hypostatization is equally problematic in its regarding of the concrete as abstract. For instance, take the flipping of a coin. Upon experience, we conclude that it's either heads or tails, and according to Bergson, illegitimately conclude that the two possibilities have somehow pre-existed the real occurrences. Not only did they allegedly pre-exist, but also conspicuously look like each other. So obviously, Bergson strongly disagrees. His theory of duration, which is based on the radical irreversibility of time, rejects any totalizing attempts. Please note that probabilities operate on the principle of totalization. The chances of either heads or tails are 1 divided by n, where n designates the total number of occurrences. So 1 divided by 2 or 50% in the case of coin. And in the case, obviously, of rolling a dice, it's 1 divided by 6, the 6 faces of a dice. In the case of roulette, it's 1 divided by 36 because roulette has 36 slots. Let's consider an example which is closer to our artistic sensibility, our artistic heart. A few years ago, a project was set up to figure out what would have been the next painting by Rembrandt. This was made possible by the newly acquired capacity to capture all his previous paintings, both the technique and their execution and content of their execution and content. You can find it still online. The project resulted in a computer-generated painting where the next Rembrandt turns out to be a right semi profile of a seated elderly man in such and such manner of laying color that would be convincing enough for any connoisseur. We seem to have reached the level of sophistication that makes it possible for anyone to produce a perfect forgery. Well, anyone except the artist himself, provided that he's alive. How so? Because of duration, which would have transformed the artist himself, herself, beyond probability, 1 divided by n. Because intelligence deals with things, and intuition is concerned with changes, with change and growth, only an artist would be capable of producing unforeseen novelty. As Simondon brilliantly put it, the knowledge of individuation equals the individuation of knowledge. And again, I invite those who have not seen the session on Simondon to check it out, because we dealt with it. And once again, I use this moment to plug Stavros's book, Architectural Technicities, on the topic of technicities. Bergson philosophy thus offers a profound lesson for students in architecture. Time, memory, duration cannot be spatialized. If time is anything, it is that which introduces indeterminacy, challenging the very idea of a fixed form. In Bergson's words from chapter 3 of Creative Mind, and I quote, "In other philosophies, time served no purpose, did nothing. Nevertheless, I said to myself, time is something, therefore it acts. What can it be doing? Plain common sense answered, time is what hinders everything from being given at once. It retards, or rather, it is retardation. It must therefore be elaboration. Would it not be a vehicle of creation and of a choice? Would not the existence of time prove that there is indeterminacy in things? Would not time be that indetermination itself?" End quote. Duration, of course, is what differs from itself. And while the cuts into duration are always spatial, the passage is irreducible to any instantaneous state. It is what happens between the two cuts. The Bergsonian discovery becomes the point of departure for what Sauvignac calls the philosophy of cinema, because it prevents us from keeping apart the physical movement and psychic image, which, of course, correspond to Locke's primary and secondary qualities, qualia. Materiality is not manifested in space, but rather in time. In his Proust and Signs, Deleuze unpacks the Bergsonian formula as follows, and I quote, "Time signifies that everything is not given. The whole is not givable. It has the strange power to affirm simultaneously fragments that do not constitute a whole in space, any more than they form a whole by succession within time. Time is precisely that transversal of all possible spaces, including the space of time." End quote. It is for this reason that deriving the possible from the real constitutes the fundamental fallacy, a cliche of reductionism, as exemplified by the next Rembrandt project. Stavros tells me that recently they attempted something similar with Vermeer. Maybe we can touch on it in the Q&A. There's a big exhibition in Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam of Vermeer's paintings. So there is no common measure between content and expression. And this is to recognize the asymmetry between the two odd, unequal, irreducible halves of the virtual and the actual, as beautifully illustrated by Bergson's Con. In contrast to phenomenology, which maintains the isomorphic symmetry between the two prongs of the empirico-transcendental double, this cone of pure memory that you see here, with its rhythms and frequencies of duration, meets the most relaxed level of duration, which is space or matter, at the point of most condensed contraction of the whole of time into the present of understanding, the point S. So for Bergson, the past is, and it not was. We continuously leap into the virtual, pure, not psychological past. And this is an ontological and not a chronological move that traverses different levels of generality and specificity, with each section containing the entirety of the past, but at varying degrees of contraction and dilation. Memories that are furthest from the point of action, S, retain their singularity and distinctiveness, while those closer to it are more general and thus immediately useful for most purposes. If somebody throws a ball to your face, you don't need to remember the exact geometry of the corridor. You just dodge the ball. To qualify my previous claim of totalization, what is abundant is not the totality, as I might have led you to think, but the total actuality of teleological reflective judgment. Allow me to indulge in a lengthy quote that explains the ramification for anybody in the business of design or creation. And I quote, "During the Great War, certain newspapers and periodicals sometimes turned aside from the terrible worries of the day to think of what would happen later once peace was restored. So nothing changed there. They were particularly preoccupied with the future of literature, and we can insert architecture here, the future of architecture. Someone came one day to ask me my ideas on the subject. A little embarrassed, I declared I had none. Do you not at least perceive, I was asked, certain possible directions? Let us grant that one cannot foresee things in detail, but you as a philosopher have at least an idea of the whole. How do you conceive, for example, of the great dramatic or architectural work of tomorrow? I shall always remember my interlocutor's surprise when I answered, if I did know what was to be the great dramatic architectural work of the future, I should be writing it, I should be designing it. I saw distinctly that he conceived the future work as being already stored up in some cupboard reserved for possibilities. Because of my long-standing relations with philosophy, I should have been able to obtain from it the key to the storehouse. But I said, the work of which you speak is not yet possible. But it must be, since it is to take place. No, it's not. I grant you, at most, that it will have been possible. What do you mean by that? It's quite simple. Let a man of talent or genius come forth, let him create a work. It will then be real, and by that very fact, it becomes retrospectively or retroactively possible. It would not be possible, it would not have been so, if this man had not come up upon the scene. That is why I tell you that it will have been possible today, but that it's not yet so. You're not serious. You're surely not going to maintain that the future has an effect upon the present, that the present brings something into the past, that action works back over the course of time and imprints its marks afterwards. That depends. That one can put reality into the past and thus work backwards in time is something I have never claimed. But that one can put the possible there, or rather that the possible may put itself there at any moment, is not to be doubted. As reality is created as something unforeseeable and new, its image is reflected behind it into the indefinite past. Thus it finds itself, it has from all time been possible, but it is at this precise moment that it begins to have been always possible. And that is why I said that it is its possibility which does not precede its reality will have proceeded once the reality has appeared. It's a tongue breaker. The possible is therefore the mirage of the present in the past. This is what I was referring to earlier as the retroactive hypostatization. And as we know, the future will finally constitute the present, and the mirage effect is continually being produced. We are convinced that the image of tomorrow is already contained in our actual present, which will be the past of tomorrow. Although we did not manage to grasp it, that is precisely the illusion, unquote. So if the past is coextensive, or better contemporaneous with the present in terms of this cone, which is the most contracted degree of the coexistent past, then the present becomes the precise point at which the past is projected towards the future. Let me just repeat the last sentence. So if the past is coextensive or contemporaneous with the present, so that the past is and not was, and this present is the most contracted degree of the coexistent past, then the present becomes the precise point in which the past is projected towards the future. The continuously varying appeal of matter to memory, this is the encounter that Stavros was describing, makes it radically open, implying that cognition is best described not as a sequence of logical computational states, but as an inclusive disjunction or a continuous trajectory through the virtual space. In other words, it involves installing oneself in duration rather than analyzing it from a psychological perspective externally. Part 2. Perception is functionally and ontologically continuous with mnemonic, imaginative, and abstractive processes, and it is not limited to the perpetually vanishing series of instants. The simple act of hearing a melody, for example, is already an act of memory that contracts a quantitative multitude into a qualitative multiplicity. Recall Meillassoux subtraction and contraction, memory and habit. However, this contraction memory is an entirely different from an engram memory of our computers, which is a sequence of bits. Bernard Cash explains the difference as follows. A contraction memory is the act by which we constitute our present or presence by contracting a series of movements into the thickness of a duration. It is the act whereby a bit of information is incarnated through a perceptual support. The emphasis is on incarnated, that is to say embodied, embedded, extended, enacted, and affected, as we are always already beyond ourselves, as it were. Contemporary neurocognitive sciences provide evidence against endoreductionist, subject-centered theories of the mind. The brain is highly susceptible to shaping by environmentally induced neural activity. In the first we learned from Winter, in the first 6 months, babies' brains make 100,000 neural connections per second, which means that brain literally thrives on stimuli. As Bruce Flexler notes in Shaping the Environments That Shape Our Brains, the emergent yet constructed environment may be taken as both effect and quasi-cause. While address retrievable memory is retrospective, going from the present to reactivate the past, this is the case with ChatGPT, content retrievable memory moves in the opposite direction, coming from the past to energize the present. It is thus prehensive in Whitehead's terms, where prehension refers to the processes of experiencing and incorporating a past event or entity into a present occasion of experience. And this process is not limited to human beings, but extends to all entities, as each entity has its own unique past and present. It is in this sense that memory is not a property of the individual, but a feature of the world. The world itself is memory, and it contains the traces of past events that are continually being prehended and incorporated into the present. Therefore, the act of memory is not an isolated or subjective event, but is always embedded within a larger, more complex web of relation. When we picture the past of an expanding or telescoping cone, then the present at its most contracted tip becomes a dimension of the past and not vice versa. Without the survival of the past in the present, there would be no duration, but only instantaneity. If the apex of Bergsonian cone, itself a process of becoming, is related to instinct, then its continuously expanding base brings us closer to intuition. Cécile Balmont provides insight into the difference between the two. This is from his text, Survival Patterns. Instinct is an immediate, instantaneous recognition of patterns. Think of apophenia, for example. On the other hand, intuition is a force that deliberately extends those patterns of survival, acting as a spur of creativity and hidden catalyst. The sharper and more honed the intuition is, the more creative the choices, says Balmont. To help us understand intuition, which is always an intuition of duration, let us use the color spectrum by way of abstraction as a function of variation. Following Bergson's example from the creative mind, let us imagine a world where the only color is orange. However, if we could fully immerse ourselves in the experience of orange, that is to say, to sympathize with it, we would eventually sense ourselves caught between red and yellow. How so? If we made an effort to carefully perceive orange, we would discern a variety of shades within it. With even more effort, we would distinguish that the darkest shade of orange is actually a different color, red, and the lightest shade is yet a different color, yellow. Therefore, by exploring the nuances of orange, we could gain a sense of the entire spectrum that lies beneath. It's about, again, about subtraction. And I think it's very close to the example of swimming in that sense. Similarly, we can sympathize with our own duration, even if our experience of duration is the only one that we know. With effort, we may sense a variety of nuances within it. And I think this is what Deleuze and Guattari mean by when they say, make yourself a body without organs. The intuition of duration connects us to a continuous spectrum, which we can explore with effort in either upward or downward direction, towards spirit or matter in Bergsonian terms. Remember the Simondonian formula. As designers individuate, they uncover tendencies or directions beyond dimensions, and this means that the knowing is something that the organism does rather than has. While intelligence starts with the conception of immobility, discreteness, triple O, and then reconstructs the idea of mobility, like the force movement of Hegelian dialectics, intuition starts with movement and regards immobility as an abstraction from reality. In his book, Creative Evolution, Bergson argues that the distinguishing feature between the instinctual response and the free response of an organism capable of making choices is the presence of a gap between the stimulus and response. Just see here on this diagram. And instinctual organism responds automatically, while with the one single response that the stimulus calls for, while the thinking organism, as the center of indetermination and action, oscillates between multiple potential responses to ever-changing circumstances. So much so that a stimulus and response, perception and action actually flip. That's what I meant by quasi-causality. So learning thus depends on the organism's ability of inserting an interval between perception and action, or as Elie Ayash puts it, on mending discontinuity by thriving in the gap itself. This is from Collapse 8 devoted to the topic of chance. I recently came across a thought-provoking post by Ayash himself, who is the author of The Blank Swan, The End of Probability, who demonstrates how relevant Bergson's ideas are in coming to terms with recent developments around automatized statistics. I deliberately use this term coined by Bruce Sterling, which, as we will see, is perhaps more fitting than artificial intelligence. In his post, Ayash reflects on the workings of ChatGPT. According to him, ChatGPT has not integrated the genius of language, but rather the library of existing texts up to, as we know, 2021. It's like asking it every time to randomly select the text from the huge library. Since we don't have insight into ChatGPT's processes on our side of the screen, that is, it doesn't matter to us whether the randomly selected text actually exists or it is produced through probabilistic combinations of existing texts. While the deterministic law is best to predict phenomena, the statistical law provides a weaker random way to predict them based on the data. Ayash argues that while we have successfully represented the random generator through probability distributions or mathematical functions, there always will be non-parametric distributions. That's again, I'm bringing it to this idea of the genuine encounter, something that cannot be subsumed under the rule. So non-parametric distributions. ChatGPT pushes the number of parameters to the limit to formally reproduce a recognizable language to the extent that its output seems like the work of a real creator, mimicking the style, tone, and even the content of existing texts. The text generated by ChatGPT is considered to be future text that could have been produced by an original writer or a painter, as we have seen with the next Rembrandt. But its probabilistic nature conceals its origin in pre-existing language patterns in its database. This means that the generated text does not bring anything new because it's randomly drawn, combined, or composed, which comes to the same thing from one and the same library, regardless of its size. Surely, every text in the library constrains the ChatGPT algorithm and influences the determination of each parameter, resulting in a calculated output for each newly generated word. In this scheme, inspiration and invention arise from the vastness of memory combined with the neural network. Admittedly, the mechanism is not limited to merely finding the identical digital text in the library, but is capable of reproducing, regenerating, and predicting. However, note the emphasis on in reproducing and regenerating. As far as predicting is concerned, Wendy Chan may be right in suggesting that data science does not so much anticipate the future, but predicts the past. So data science at this current stage, and that's why I call it automatized statistics with Sterling, does not so much anticipate the future, but predicts the past in this sense. Although the brain, being a network of neurons itself, has for the moment more connections than ChatGPT, it cannot retain and learn all the existing texts as ChatGPT does. But it can learn language and live in the world. And therein lies the rub. Through the intersection of matter and memory, the material world as existential niche can and does accelerate learning processes. Humans can learn more effectively through their bodies than through a network of neurons alone. As Deleuze put it, and we've heard it already, something in the world forces us to think. And this something is not an object of recognition, but a fundamental encounter. And we should therefore reread Bergson's theory of the body and the image in the light of ChatGPT. After all, the library of images with which Bergson begins his text on matter and memory is quite comparable to the ocean of images or text that we feed ChatGPT. As a matter of fact, I think it was last week, version 4 can be fed not only by texts, but also by audio files and images. So the crucial question, according to Ayash, is to ask is whether the new writing originates from the past library or of existing texts or from the pure past. Ayash concludes that how ChatGPT proved to be nothing more than a function for building from the library of existing texts with no additional mystique or of inspiration. The ability to create something new would require a level of originality and unpredictability that cannot be achieved through statistical modeling alone. It is precisely this closure of the library, operated by ChatGPT, that separates matter from memory, or world from word, if you will. We have yet to define the situation which envelopes the body, and first of all, the possibility that this body or matter has of rarefaction. This is a term from Measu. I have already hinted at the subtractive nature of experience, and it becomes clear that ChatGPT, on the contrary, is an extreme case of accumulation. Unlike the body, it's absolutely and at any time depends on the entire library, so there's no rarefaction there. We thus conclude with Ayash that it is necessary to divert the immense interpolation employed by ChatGPT in favor of framing and thus imposing enabling constraints, and this may need to be done in a reverse manner from ChatGPT. Ayash confesses to have always thought that the text he himself produced never left him. They only extended his memory space, except that he could not retain them anymore because they do not exist by their numerical identity, so they are not address retrievable. To write is to forget, which is arguably a matter of relating each concept to the variables that determine its mutations. What is contingent and what is necessary? You have to forget. And it's interesting because in a kind of striking reversal, this is, it seems as if artificial intelligence forgets to forget. This is in reversal of what Rosie Dotti is claiming, that the indigenous people have not forgotten to forget because they still, but in this case, I think it might work. So the objective is to create non-pre-existent relations by enabling the variables to function together in a singular and non-homogeneous whole, which may engender a new mode of existence. In contrast to ChatGPT, in the mode of interpolation, we write texts and we do design things for extrapolation, while interpolation is the process of estimating unknown values that fall between known values. Extrapolation involves intuiting that which is not explicitly available in the given data. Dealing with the unknown unknowns presents an epistemological challenge, while the non-entailment in extrapolation figures as an ontological or ontogeneric issue. So, part 3. So let us briefly turn our attention to the Bergsonian trope, image equals movement from Bergson's Matter and Memory, which is related to the issue of ontogeneric framing. It should not come as a surprise that François Zorubashvili, one of the most prominent readers of Bergson through Deleuze, believed that in 200 years, we would be teaching that 20th century philosophy had ended with 2 hieroglyphs, the movement image being one of them. If we move beyond the bucket theory of mind, where nothing gets lost, can we use the allegory of the searchlight? Yes, but with a caveat. This is not a reference to the philosophical tradition that places light on the side of spirit and portrays consciousness as a beam of light that draws things out of their native darkness, as it were. As you might have anticipated, phenomenology falls squarely within such tradition, as if the intentionality of consciousness, its aboutness, were a beam of spotlight. Remember, for phenomenology, all consciousness is consciousness of something. For Bergson, it is complete opposite. Things are luminous by themselves without anything illuminating them. So all consciousness is something. And it is indistinguishable from the thing. That is from the image of light. I draw here on Deleuze's Cinema 1. So it is not consciousness that is light, but rather the other way around. Regarding our consciousness of fact, it will merely be the opacity in the absence of which light is always propagated without its source ever being revealed. So that's the rarefaction idea. So the opacity rather than transparency. Subtraction, ascesis rather than enrichment. As Whitehead explains in his Process and Reality, the philosophies of substance presuppose a subject that encounters a datum and then reacts to it. By contrast, in process philosophies, the world does not emerge from the subject, as in Kant, but the subject emerges from the world. No coincidence that Whitehead doesn't even refer to a subject, but superject. This makes subjectification an aesthetic, or better, ethico-aesthetic condition. In contrast to phenomenology, where the problem of construction of signs, that Stavros touched on in the closing argument, becomes the problem of bestowal of meaning. In Deleuze's account, it is sense, as in orientation or potential, that is productive of signs and their significance. The distinction between meaning and sense maps onto the difference between signification and significance, the 2 regimes of signifying and asignifying semiosis. So for Bergson, the life form itself becomes an image among other images. And this special image, center of indetermination, creatively selects from some images from the universal flux and forgets the rest. And this is exactly what this diagram is all about. So Deleuze explains in Cinema 1, and I quote, "The thing and the perception of the thing are one and the same thing, one and the same image, but related to one or other of the 2 systems of reference. The thing is the image as it is in itself, as it is related to all other images to whose action it completely submits and on which it reacts immediately. But the perception of the thing is the same image related to another special image which frames it and which only retains a partial action from it and only reacts to it immediately. If in perception thus defined, there is never anything else or anything more than there is in the thing. On the contrary, there is less, again, ascetic approach. So we perceive the thing minus that which does not interest us. That's the forgetting bit, as a function of our needs." End quote. So the indeterminate center of action within, so not of representation, the indeterminate center of action, not representation, within an a-centered universe is Bergson's term for the body in his ascetic theory of perception. As we have seen in Bergson's account, the body functions as a kind of filter, sieve, that according to its embodied capacities selects precisely the images that are relevant to it from among a universe of images circulating around it. think of UX schools, Umwelt, you know, the case of a tick that just selects 3 affects, the rest just obliviously to them. So put bluntly, selection is creation. And this conundrum has been taken up by Bergson's major thesis on time. Once again, the past coexists with the present that it has been. The past is preserved in itself as a past in general, so non-chronological past. At each moment, time splits itself into the present and past, present that passes and past which is preserved. In other words, consciousness is time. So to conclude, it is our experience of a never actually lived pure past that provides hints of the transcendental field of the virtual and the conception of time as a duration whole. In contrast to phenomenology, corporate, which makes movement relative to poses and gives natural perception privilege, Bergson's starting point is a world of continuously changing movement images, a world of matter in constant flux with no anchorage or assignable points of reference. It's any space whatever. As Deleuze insisted after Bergson, if there is photography, it is already snapped, already shot. In her writings on the Anthropocene, Claire Colebrook has been cautioning that it is precisely anthropocentrism with its subordination of difference to identity that will eventually turn out to be not only anti-human, but also suicidal, perhaps. In contrast to the all-too-human world of phenomenology, where consciousness is the searchlight summoning up things from their native obscurity, as it were, we have to become worthy of the post-human or more than human process of worlding, made intelligible by the event of Bergsonism. And to end, more on this you will hear next week, this time, from Bob and Heidi. To end on a Nietzschean note, though, given our modes of existence, as sustained by the niche constructionist effort, we always have the thoughts, beliefs, and values that we deserve. That's it. So
wow. Thank you. What a trip. That was incredible. we had and I love the way that the two of you kind of connected things with contemporary life, either Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or ChatGPT for sure. I just want to mention that if we could have anyone who's got any questions on who's watching the live stream on YouTube, please just send them in, and we will on the chat there, and we can get them. We already have a question. Victoria, do you want to ask your question? Don't want to put you on the spot.
Hi. Hi. Yeah, I'm traveling, so I'm probably not going to be able to turn on my video, but thank you so much. This was incredible and very inspiring. A lot of thoughts, but I think the thought that I had was to kind of going back to what Stavros was talking about. I thought it was interesting because all of these philosophers that are process-oriented really kind of highlight the importance of creating meaningful connections through stepping into this really vast field of virtual field of potentialities. And that really goes beyond the simple answers as we've heard. And this irresolution is actually what kind of enlivens the world. So I think it's interesting because as was kind of obvious in the talk, it's kind of going really stark in contrast to the ubiquitous technocratic approach that is so kind of prevalent and ubiquitous in our world today, especially thinking about big data, thinking about artificial intelligence. So for me, I think it's really important for my daily life to find ways to kind of break out of it. And I think for me, I've heard you guys talk about embodiment and kind of practices that bring you into a field of potentiality. So I would love to know how you two think about that also in your classroom, how to connect these other ways of being and thinking to the way you teach or the way you kind of are yourself in the world. So if there's an answer to that, thank you so much.
It's great to hear your voice, Victoria.
Hi, thank you.
I don't see you, but your voice, great to hear you again.
Go ahead, Andrej. Go ahead. Or you want a moment to catch your breath?
I mean, one way of answering is we have just submitted, and I'm always hesitant because this is a vast, but I will say it anyway. We have just submitted a grant application, and realize, of course, we have to spell in advance what exactly will be innovative about it, which defeats the whole purpose of doing it to begin with. So we are caught up in this kind of impossible world where you have to in advance make promises, so that cancels out any possibility of any meaningful research or intuition or being innovative. But one way of dealing with it is I'm very proud to say that this kind of experiment that we have attempted and it seems to work is to in terms of teaching theory, we have run a pilot. I think it was last year we did it for the first time to break the habit of delivering lectures. We have invented after a beautiful text whose authors now escape me and the title escapes me, the idea of reading together. They say it's very common for people to have dinners together, to go out together, watch a movie together, but never ever do they read together. So what we do is we read together with the whole class a text which provides literally food for thought, and then we respond to any, at any point we stop this reading and go in a direction that is presents itself in terms of a question of simple disambiguation or something that triggers something else, and therefore we always end up in most unexpected trajectories and going on a tangent each time, and I think this perhaps is one way of trying to insert ourselves in the duration, to speak with Bergson.
If I may, before because I see Gilles has a question, but if I may add something to this, because for the sake of time, I removed a part of this lecture, which actually responds to that question that Victoria is now asking, and it was also part of an artificially kind of posed question, let's say, in the end of the lecture that I gave before, which is then okay, all is good and science are extremely important. I mean, also Andrej finished with the line on science in there from Plus, but how one can learn or can educate themselves to pick up science. And that's something that, well, it's also a concern of mine as well, and therefore I've also given a thought about it. I had to remove it again for time reasons, but now I have the option and the chance to speak a bit briefly about it. I think it's not a coincidence that Andrej finished off with Proust, because it's also where Deleuze and many after Deleuze have picked up an initial approach to science. It was also Proust not directly speaking about science, but speaking about I wouldn't even call it a method, because it's not a method. It's more of an attitude. And already the term attitude, I find it makes much more justice to that, rather than just concretizing it as a fixed methodology, suppose. And it's what Proust was calling minor questions, and Deleuze picked up on that. Deleuze is placing in an opposition the dogmatic image of thought, the image of thought that I would even say, following Andrej's lecture, is also a ChatGPT AI image of thought. It's a dogmatic one. It's a dogmatic one. I mean, I can explain it later on why I call it that. It might sound provocative, but it's a dogmatic one because eventually it's dealing with things, as the lecture was going previously, with things that are immutable, with things that are static. And in their staticness, they can come in all kinds of different recompositions and rearrangements. That's what makes ChatGPT or any AI both valuable in its own right, but also something that could be and should be rethought in the way that we are actually at least taking advantage of it. What a non-dogmatic image of thought would do would be never to ask a what is question. What is questions are the ones that are actually propelling forward this very reductionist way of thinking. So to engage science, to pick up science, one first of all needs to be always posing and putting themselves in, as I was mentioning, in a slightly experimental attitude, which means not experimental for the sake of being experimental, but experimental where the word experimental meets actually its root, which means experience. So one needs to place things back in experience. It's only by placing things or acknowledging, let's say, the intensive force brought by experience that one can start, let's say, getting into a relationship with science. one gets into a relationship with science when one is putting themselves back into experience, and one, when doing so, can start asking a different set of questions. According to Proust, which Deleuze picked up, these questions are minor questions, and they're not the questions of a voluntary platonic friend of truth, an idea, a problem that one is having, but actually the one of a jealous lover. So Proust was saying that we should be jealous lovers to the problems that we are bothered with. And jealous lovers do not ask what is questions. When a jealous lover is both engaged and enchanted, but also threatened by the intensity of jealousness, is asking questions that are going towards the line, when is this thing happening? Where is it happening? How is it happening? For whom is it happening? What is the purpose of that thing that's going on? So I would recommend, again, trying to respond to Victoria in a very long way, I would recommend that if one is to find themselves in the position that they can start getting into closer, intensive contact with science, one of the very first, very broad, let's say, quote unquote, methodological issues to put forward would be to start asking these minor questions. We can even do it for, let's say, Andrej wanted to put today artificial intelligence for reasons that he can explain perhaps even more later on. But we could ask that question about intelligence, or let alone artificial intelligence. When is something intelligent? Where is intelligent behavior, if we're classifying like that, to be found? How is something classified as intelligent? What is the purpose even of being intelligent? Okay, so if we put these questions together, by necessarily these questions are bringing it back to experience itself, our questioning, our problematizing. And by bringing it to experience itself, because when you ask a where question, there always comes a place, and a moment later on, there always comes a situation, a condition that unfolds. These questions necessitate the acknowledgement of science in order to be responded, the acknowledgement of experience itself. So that would be my 2 cents on the issue. Andrej, you want to contribute to that more, or we'll go to Gilles?
Let's move on. Yes, I'm happy. I mean, to give more chance to more people as possible.
Igor, do you want to cover your question? Then we got Sriyank, who's here in Ahmedabad with me.
Okay, I can asking question now.
Please do.
Yes.
Okay, thanks so much for all of your intriguing and passionate lecture about the metaphysical knowledge from the Bergson. I interested in the very much. So I would asking a question about the relationship between the architecture phenomenon and with the human consciousness, because I'm a PhD candidate studying in architecture and the city. So as my PhD work was focused on Kousoulas' work on the consumption of congestion as the main thread, explored the cultural, social, political, economical implications, how to emphasize on the urban's congestion, and in which way I classified the 27 types of congestion as the social congestion, political congestion, and the power congestion, include especially the presumptions congestion, that part quote from the Bergson's work. But all of the, as another architecturist work, as many in Kousoulas' work, argues majority about increasing scales of contemporary architecture has contributed a sense of indifference and disorientation and alienation in urban psychosenses as the buildings become intense and the density and more large and more imposing. That can lead to subjective feelings of congestion and overcrowding, and individuals become dwarfed by the building circumstances around them. So my questions would be, in what way does the increasing scale of contemporary architecture conflict with the Bergson's point? Bergson's theory, how emphasis on the importance of the human subjective experience and the human perception, and how maybe the Kousoulas' arguments as the majority is architecturist work and the architecture scholars, the way to argue about the relationship between the architecture and the human skills be informed by Bergson's ideas about the interplay between the physical matters and the memories and the consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, yeah, that would be, I very like to hear your idea.
Yes. What I was trying to do with it's a broad brush, schema where I'm distinguishing between the three logics. When I say that the classical logic of creation distinguishes between the perfect essences and the imperfect incarnations, and then the phenomenology comes and replaces it by the logic of foundation. How can we legitimately be talking about this or that? And then finally, like what I reframed as Bergsonism, the new materialism. I was actually making a case for ever evolving sensorium, so that what is designed is not just our environment or our niche, but also our capacity to sense is being as it were designed, and this is why I think that this is why we have to step out of this tradition of that locks us in the opposition between the objective and the subjective, talking about the experience, so-called subjective experience, as opposed to something that is now made possible by artificial intelligence, namely unbiased approach, where finally we can arrive at something that is purely objective. And it seems to me that one of the legacies of Bergson is to say that the thought and experience, I mean, all these things were always already sufficiently contaminated and dependent on each other, reciprocally determined, so that there is no need for us to continue, following this idea that the movement occurs in space and it's physical, and there's something that occurs in the mind. The ontological, I even put it in the slide, the ontological curtain that falls between one and the other, one and the many. It seems to me that Bergson offers a way out of this impasse by attuning us to the possibility that actually the world is memory. So all these developments that you're describing, they are not just added to something that is already been there, but by addition of these new scales, new congestion, new densities, you're always you're effectively rearranging. You're rearranging and saturating the space of virtualities to the problem that may then engender a radically different subject. And I've been, I think, too often referring to gladly so to Kousoulas, who very early picked it up, and he said New York was at one point literally turned into a laboratory that would produce a metropolitan subject that could have not been predicted at all. And I think he belongs to a very small fraction of architects who is neither technophobic nor technophiliac Luddite. He actually understands to what an extent I think these things work together, the material and the discursive part of the assemblage. Stavros, can you comment?
Yes, and one might read more about this kind of consensus of yours. Since you did it for me, I only feel obliged to do the same. So one can only read these things in this, let's say, very nice publication of Mr. Radman, which is Ecologies of Architecture, Essays and Generalization. I would like to it's continuing the same line that Andrej opened now. There is other thinkers of that period with Bergson, contemporaneous even, like William James. And William James would go and would heavily, one would say, let's say, what Bergson was for, Bergson crossed both parts of the Atlantic, so both the continental and the analytic, let's say, modes of doing philosophy. William James was coming more from the so-called analytic one, but he was a particular figure because in the same time or slightly earlier than Bergson, with very similar concerns, he was putting forward his approach towards experience by saying that there is something that we can call pure experience. And pure experience comes before any subjective or objective delineations, let's say, where we split apart in saying that I am the subject that experiences things like that, and this is the object that I can consume. the breaking of that binary of the subjective and the objective, it might sound like just a slightly, I don't know, like a conceptual fetishism and not necessary thing to do, but it's actually extremely important, and it is extremely important precisely because if we connect it back to the discussion on the so-called differential relations, problematic fields, the virtual, so that field of capacities, you can start seeing that the subject is nothing but also itself a solution, and it also has a very temporal dimension, that solution, to a certain problematic field. So you can do that same thing for terms like, if not for the subject, which might be a more heavy endeavor, but it's really worth it, you can do that same thing for terms like congestion, for example. You can see the term congestion that we could all take for granted were we too long to do that. If we don't take it for granted, to what kind of problematic field does it correspond? Where is that problematic field that congestion is being borne out? And in going there, you might find ways that, intuitively speaking, afterwards, with no specific methodology given in advance, you might be able to find connections that are not given. You might be able to find, let's say, moments that are not prescribed, and you might eventually, if you are lucky, if one is lucky, find themselves in a position where they can actually provide a novel understanding to the term itself. I'm not going to go into more detail about congestion specifically because that's not of interest, but we can leave it there, I would say.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you for your wonderful question. Thanks.
Srilank, do you want to ask your question?
Sorry, basically, thank you for the presentation. I disconnected in between Professor Andrej's presentation, but my interest anyways are also was triggered by Stavros' presentation. And I have two-part question. The first question is basically, first of all, I think it's interesting that Delft is taking on this responsibility almost to kind of, bridge the gap between metaphysics and architecture thinking, so to speak. So my first question is pertaining to that. And I know that there is a course that Professor Andrej once spoke about, maybe it's still there, metaphysics for architects. So that's my first question, basically. Where do you say, how do you see the relationship between metaphysics, architecture, and its relationship to contemporary, let's say, conditions that we inhabit? So that would be my first part, and I'll ask the second part in a bit. So.
Thank you so much. I think you were referring to a course, Metaphysics for Millennials. I wasn't part of that.
Millennials, sorry, yeah. Yes.
Definitely. It was our colleague, Stephen Reed, who ran it for a few years, and it might be revived very soon. I think, Stavros, you want to go first? Or?
No, you go.
Okay. I think this is, I evoked Kant earlier, and Deleuze was very vocal about the necessity. I'm following basically, literally the footsteps of Bergson. He said we have to find the metaphysics that would match the sophistication of the contemporary physics or sciences. So previously, it was Euclidean geometry, and now we have something at our disposal that have not yet found its matching partner in metaphysics, namely nonlinear dynamic system theories, and it seems to me that, but on an even more elementary level, I think when I'm particularly keen on extending the realm of architecture beyond the ontic register, things that are actual. And this is why I invoked, and Stavros challenged me to mention, why is it that I'm so concerned about the Chat GPT and all these developments. It seems to me that we are trapped in the ontic world still. We are reshuffling things that are manifest, and leave out that which escapes, which is these things that are incorporeal. But with Bergson, we have learned that the fact that something is incorporeal doesn't mean that it's not real. So the set of values and all these things that motivates one's action are literally metaphysical. They're not physical, and yet they're so incredibly real. I have recently I've come across a beautiful interview with Giuseppe Longo, who gives an example, and I think it's pretty evocative. He says that there are people who believe that if you could that if you fed the computer with all the data of astronomy from the past, they would come up with models and he says this is basically so myopic because the shift from the geocentric to the heliocentric system was not triggered by sciences, and it's not even intuitive in the sense that it doesn't come from experience, because we all live, from our particular point of view, we couldn't do this unless we have developed geometries, and these geometries were to a certain extent they stem out of pictorial interest in perspective, in drawing in perspective. So it seems as if all these major paradigm shifts have contributed, and none of them could be let's say made discrete, or they cannot be formalized. So I'm always thinking about this. What is it that makes things complex? According to scientists such as Rosen, he says that what is complex is that it's not a matter of scale or number. It's anything and everything that resists compression, or anything that resists that cannot be simulated. And I think it seems to me that that's what I was at one point. I mean, in the presentation, touched on this idea that not everything is formalizable, or not everything is parameterizable, non-parametric moment that we somehow leave out if we continue to simply be enchanted by the manifest level, the discrete logic. And Bergson says intelligence deals exclusively with discrete things.
Yeah,
we need the logic of non-discreteness, of continuity. Sorry, Stavros.
No, sorry, what? No, actually, I should thank you, because you're giving me the perfect line to what I wanted to say about Sreyang's question. And yeah, leaving aside metaphysics for millennials, whether it's a course or not. But anyway, metaphysics for architects. Let's go directly to metaphysics for architects in the broad level of the term. Basically, I mean, metaphysics have always been broken apart into two, I'm simplifying, but two broad categories, two broad, let's say, categories is also opposed to what I want to say, but let's call it two broad trajectories, two broad directions, okay? And metaphysics is not, it's a fancy term for systematized thinking. So that's what metaphysics stands for. So how can one think systematically? How can one think and engage with the world systematically? Okay, that's what metaphysics, at least that's how I would translate it very briefly. These two very broad terms of how one can think systematically, these very broad trajectories, one of them is called transcendental thinking, the other one is called immanent thinking. I'm not going to go and explain them now, but the transcendental thinking also could be understood as a generalizing, reductionist, generic way of thinking. The immanent way of thinking can be understood as one that it's not generalizing, is not reductionist, and therefore it is genetic. Simondon also was using this opposition between generic science and thought and genetic science and thought. In architecture, for example, if you approach architecture typologically, and also if you approach it as a discourse with its own, let's say, closed boxes and its own closed, let's say, quarters, it's a generic approach to architecture as a science and as a doing. A genetic approach to architecture is one that thinks more towards the verb architecting rather than the categorizing of the outputs of the verb architecting. So it's much more in tune to the productive capacities of actually architecting, doing architecture, whatever that might mean. The genetic line of thinking is a line of thinking that, unfortunately, it has slightly, we could say, a rich history in philosophy, even though it has always fallen towards more a minor, let's say, trajectory in there. It was never picked up and spread as much as it should have been. But there is a line of thinking in there. You can find Giordano Bruno, Leibniz, Spinoza, Mammon, Nietzsche, James, Bergson, Whitehead, Simondon, Deleuze, Rouyer. Many people fall in that genetic line of thinking. Unfortunately, in architecture, I mean, if let alone for philosophy, this has not been a major strand. For architecture, it's been even less of a major strand. This approach to understand architecture genetically. The issue with understanding architecture genetically, however, is that it cannot be done in general. It cannot be done once and for all. It demands a continuous re-engagement with the very topic that one is after. So, to your question specifically, I wouldn't say that there is one fixed response to that. I would say that, however, if one is interested into approaching architecture genetically and not categorizing in general, from typologies to schools of thought to actual schools of practice, etc., the very first thing that one should do, and that's where Andrej's line finished before, and that's why I thanked him, is you can pick up the advice that I suppose Bergson also would approve, and it's an advice that comes from Simondon, and says that one should never break apart structure and operation. As architects, we tend often to break apart structure, let's say, of a building, with the operation, again, let's say, of a building, or form and function in terms that are closer to us. If, and that's a very broad if, because I insist it can be done in an infinite manner of ways, and each one of us, again, thank God, can do it in its own different style. If we don't take that binary of structure and operation, form and function, and try rather to see how these two are co-productive, they work with one another, and what could be these logics of their working, I think that's a very important first step towards a metaphysics that is not just for millennials, but it's actually for I would say, an everlasting architectural thought and doing.
I think our students are not even millennials anymore, no?
No, exactly. It's much more than that, much more recent than that.
I was thinking also when you said this, one possible example from architecture, because we tend to always gravitate towards the abstract, is Gilles Moore. I think he's done a good work in terms of arguing that, in spite of what we, seemingly is obvious that the buildings are stable, he says they're never stable. He wants to say that the building are never isolated at all. They are always full of, just the load-bearing capacity, all the movement that goes through the building, in spite of the appearances, is we should reconsider. So I recommend his. I think his work is, one book is called Empire State Building, where he does this magic of moving, tuning us to the movements, however imperceptible they might be.
So I have a follow-up question, and it's related to Stavros's presentation, which is basically where a matter of style is invoked. I think it's a very interesting kind of a subject, and something that I'm studying and researching at the moment, and my PhD kind of revolves around realism, metaphysics, and style in some sense. So I was just intrigued to see Bergson kind of speaking of entering into this subject, and I would like to know if Stavros would want to elaborate a little bit on that, and where does Bergson speak of this? So it will be a just good reference for me to pick up from that. Yeah.
Andrej might know more, but I'm not familiar exactly where Bergson might speak of style. I mean, both Andrej and I were, as I said, bastardizing a bit various thinkers. So I don't recall a point where Bergson refers to style directly. But and it's connected a bit with some questions that appear in the chat that have to do with more contemporary, with more of our contemporary, let's say, conditions and modes of production and existence when it comes to architecture. I would say that style as the expression of a resolution of a problematic field, it's in its own, it's not something that is to be placed in the abstract. It's not something that has a separate structure from a separate operation. They're both working together. To make that even more clear, and I picked that up in a book by Mario Carpo, The Alphabet and the Algorithm was called. The style originates from the ancient Latin term stylus, which literally means this. It means a pen in our case, any hard pointy instrument that can inscribe in a surface. So even the Romans back then, they were knowledgeable enough to figure out and think that how we inscribe stuff into the world, how we do stuff in the world, is productive of the manner and the expression of those stuff that we do. So when I would speak about style, and again, turning to the questions of the contemporary issues that we can find in there, my approach, and Andrej pitched already the book and advertised it, it would be to try to find ways, that this this so-called broadly style could be starting to become a bit more apparent. My attempt to do that is again by using Simondon and his term of technicities, which from Simondon, the term of technicities stands for something very simple. Basically, connecting it with a lecture previously would be that the resolution of a problematic field is pushed forward by our technicities of engaging with the world. And our technicities of engaging with the world is literally how we, humans in that case, use technology in a very broad sense to change our environment, and how this process transforms at once both humans, both technology, and environment itself. Again, we fall into a chicken and egg situation in there, but I would again try to underline before Andre says something. I would again try to underline. But when we think in terms of technicities, in understanding our styles of resolving a problematic field, it becomes obvious that there's not one single way, not just because we decided so. So it's not a matter of ideology. So it's not an issue that Andre decided to do things differently than me, and you decided to do different things than I do. It's because we find ourselves occupying a specific part of this portion of experience that in its own technicities of producing itself, it pushes us to a certain resolution of a field. The important thing would be how to analyze those technicities, how to intervene to those technicities. It becomes therefore a matter not of the geniusness of an inventor or the geniusness of a designer or the geniusness of a thinker, but rather a matter of, in an intuitive process, can we find the singular moments where things are composable and compatible with those existing current undergoing technicities.
I just want to add one more thing because it's still fresh in my mind. Last Wednesday, I think we dealt with it in class, this idea of, first of all, again, to refer to this, the three columns, and the third one I qualified as expressionism, and claiming that this has nothing to do with the paradigms of representation, insofar as any content then is so big that it has to be resolved by giving an expression or something that is of course connected to the content only by way of progressive differentiation. So there's isomorphism between the two, but without resemblance and so on. But I was also thinking in purely now not metaphysical but physical terms, this idea of the constancy of matter and energy, which means that it's in a way it's something that is finite. It cannot, you can't just inject new matter and new energy in not just in this world but in this cosmos, in this universe. But what you can do, you can reshuffle it, you can change the way it's distributed, and by so it seems as if in this very sense you have the finity, you have the unlimited possibilities of reshuffling. So you have something that now opens up the possibility of doing it otherwise. So the style, not in this superficial sense of labeling something as stylistic or style, but in terms of reshuffling elements, so to do them differently or otherwise, in spite of the fact that we have the limited resources and literally kind of finite limited resources, is this kind of, it seems to me that that's the mechanism that Stavros is describing. You were referring it to in terms of the how to, in simple terms, and there's a beautiful image of this that comes from dynamic system theory. You have a room of a certain geometry and you have a certain number of tiles. How are you going to tile the floor is any up for grabs, and so that would be.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful.
Thank you for your wonderful question. Thanks.
So we have a question in the chat from Vasco, who's in Bangladesh. We're straddling the world tonight, especially the Indian subcontinent. I'm not sure whether Vasco has able to switch on his video and speak. Normally he has trouble with his microphone. Vasco, is your microphone working today? Otherwise I can read out your question. Okay, maybe he's not with us at the moment.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, he is. Okay, Vasco. Yeah.
No, he's asking to read it. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, okay. Okay, so Bergson's philosophy has been criticized for being overly optimistic and idealistic, and for failing to address issues of social and political conflict. How might Bergson's ideas be applied to contemporary social and political issues? And what are some of the potential limitations and challenges? Hold on a second, I can't read this. I've lost that, sorry. You can read it. Sorry, a second.
To this approach.
This approach, sorry. Okay, yeah.
You want to go first, Andrej?
Go, please.
I don't know. I mean, I would challenge, first of all, the idealistic and optimistic part. And even if it would be called idealistic, then it's idealistic with a twist. And I find that twist quite interesting because it's not idealistic with the idea being placed in a supposed fixed endpoint that we just strive to reach it, but it's an idea that builds itself continuously. I think, I mean, I said before that Bergson finds himself in this line of thinkers that were trying to think genetically, and in trying to think genetically as well, Bergson was trying to find, I mean, his most famous concept, the élan vital, which none of us really touched thoroughly today, but it's his effort, his approach to try to figure out how life lives itself. So how life produces itself, without anyone guiding it or any principle guiding it in advance. If he had done certain mishaps, or if there were mishaps in there, I wouldn't say that this is a problem. In the negative sense of the term problem. I would say that the endeavor itself and the ambition itself is worth even perhaps some of the mishaps that were to be found in there. The attempt of Bergson, to do what other people like Uxküll contemporarily were saying, think of a melody that sings itself. That's what the Uxküll was saying. Later on, Ruyer would pick up a line and say that we need to think in terms of make, and by making, make yourself. So thinking this very immanent, very co-constitutive way of thinking, where there's no fixed end term, fixed principle, either in the end or in advance, that guides this process. I would say that besides the particularities of perhaps certain mishaps from Bergson, is something that has great political and social, these are disputable fields, what's a political and a social field, but it has great political and social value. If one would be able to understand politics not in ideological, prefixed and predetermined terms, if would one be able to understand society, not in categories that are neatly placed and either compete or form alliances, but rather understand them, Foucault would say genealogically, understand them as producing themselves, that's already an extremely politically, socially charged contribution that Bergson could bring forward when appropriated and when being read nowadays.
I think it is almost inevitable. I think we have received a similar question with Simondon, if I'm not mistaken. The problem is that you're right. I think Stavros, to refer to this idea of that the process philosophy very often is considered to be apolitical, and I think Radman always talks about this lava lamp idea, because it is very difficult for anybody who comes from a tradition that starts from the discrete, the metaphysical terms, like understands the setup of the world as something discrete, and then so that you can carefully actually maintain or adopt a critical distance vis-a-vis everything that is around you, and then formulate a set of programmatic instructions and work in order to accomplish a certain goal. I think for them it's very disorienting to think that the knowledge of individuation is the individuation of knowledge. That is to say, you're always already implicated. So they say that instead of thinking in terms of the politics with a capital P, as in Messianic project, you can act politically, and you do it by way of immersing yourself, making yourself a body without organs, trying to see what are the salient points of inflection where you might, however, incrementally contribute to a certain movement. That is, but you're never alone in this. And if we displace this idea of a bounded subject, who deliberate individual who makes rational choices and therefore has a certain way of. Then it's everything is up for grabs, and it calls for a very different attitude. I don't know. Trying to think. That's what Stavros touched on by reference to this major and minor tradition. I would say the minor tradition is more interested in setting up the problem so that might engender its own solutions rather than simply act in terms of opposition or resistance. Because the moment, this is what Masumi does in his wonderful essay. What is it? Do you remember the title? Where he says even like the woke attitude is still reactionary because it reacts to something that is already there. So it's caught up in the dance that Bergson wouldn't necessarily want to participate in.
But if we go strictly to politics, and I mean, Andrej heard me many times mentioning it. I mean, politics in its relation with the original sense of the term that comes from polis, which means a city. I mean, basically, it means just a city, an urban, let's say, an urban. How can I call it? Agglomerate. I don't want to use the term assemblage, not to open an over discussion on assemblages. But anyway, an urban agglomerate, a polis, is where politics come from. And essentially, therefore, you could understand that politics is particularly in that line of thinking, dealing with complexity. Okay, what makes the difference between a village where there's 5 people living and a polis, a city where there's 1 million people living? It's a matter of, it's an issue of complexity. It's not just an issue of scale. Actually, any discussion on scale is not a discussion on different sizes. It's an issue of different complexities, okay? Not better or worse, just different. So politics is trying to deal with complexity. If we understand it so broadly, so de-ideologize it, remove left, right, up and down, let's say, connotations, but we just understand politics as trying to deal with complexity and ways to deal with complexity. Again, I think that if not for anything else, Bergson's notions on the pure memory and the constitution of subjectivity as something that is not fixed, on intuition, as I was trying to say, even these two, those two alone, can give us a much more sensitive approach to politically / complexity regarded issues than many of the politics that thinkers, famous political thinkers, have neatly placed in categories. So I would say that Bergson, in dealing with complexity, and therefore in dealing with politics and being political, perhaps could be much more interesting and important than many of the figures we usually associate with that. Intuition, for example, in the line that also Andrej picked, when it comes to science, and if to be intuitive means to be sensitive to science, it has various levels of practice involved in there. There is science that you have familiarized yourself so much that they are habits of yours. So drinking 1 cup of coffee in the morning instead of 20, it's you having familiarized yourself with the good science of 1 cup of coffee versus the bad science of 20 cups of coffee. But besides this familiar science, these familiar habits, let's say, that we have developed with science, the more one gets to entertain and educate themselves in sensitivity to science, the more one can actually become sensitive to science that one is not familiar with. And therefore, again, close the loop now, turn the discussion into politics, turn the discussion of complexity, because you can, again, make a very broad distinction by saying that what we broadly call progressive versus conservative politics is actually a way of opposing or not, of embracing or not, the familiar, non-familiar science. Okay? A progressive politics is one that actually is open, is sensitive, is willing to engage with non-familiar science. A conservative politics is one that restrains and comes back into itself and tries to force and protect, let's say, itself from anything that it's non-familiar to it. So even there, again, I mean, I made some intellectual jumps, but even there, the attitude that people like Bergson and others of that line are advocating, despite some of its mishaps, I would say it's extremely important, much more so than many of the traditional figures we associate with politics.
You have a question in the chat. Lala, do you want to ask your question? Or again, I can read it out for you.
Can you ask?
Okay. Question. Switching from static to dynamic, it sounds sensible, but how is it actionable? computer systems can respond to the external problem quickly and almost automatically. How can architects do the same?
Andrej, you were the ChatGPT guy today.
Yes,
So
I was at one point. I showed the diagram, and I was actually claiming the opposite, not about how fast we can respond to something, because I think with the Bergsonian cone, what he's differentiating is different degrees of contraction and the dilution. In other words, he wants to say that closer you are to the apex, the more general the response, in the sense that you are not necessarily attuned to every feature of let's say, of your surrounding space. You are simply dodging the ball at that particular point. But that doesn't prevent you also from plunging into that virtual space in case you needed to expand your intuition the closer you get to the base. I followed it up by this another diagram with these converging sides. When you might remember, it was three forms of life. So the one that occupied the apex in this particular case is the animal that is not capable of conceptual. It doesn't have conceptual capacity. That is to say, it operates purely in like an automata. You step on a snake, snake bites you. Snake it cannot insert the gap between the stimulus and the response. And of course, this applies also to the distinction, the gap, or the interval between the perception and action. In the middle of the diagram, I put the cat, inspired by Gregory Bateson's essay, where he's talking about the title is "The Cat's Nip is Not a Bite." So he wants to say that a cat already has the capacity for what if capacity, to play as if something is. So it's not it's a nip is not a bite, because it's not it's not trapped in this vital space where the stimulus and the response are short-circuited. It has the capacity to play for play. And once we arrive at the broadest point, which is, I think, also coincides with the base of Bergsonian cone. There, you can literally insert the interval between the stimulus and the response. And one example that I've used in my text comes from when Hannah Arendt talks about this purely from philosophical point of view, when the idea of turning the other cheek. So you, as it were, cut the chain, the causal chain between the stimulus and the effect, and therefore you step out of the causal linear causality, full stop. So you abandon the mechanistic world, and perhaps this brings you closer to what I was referring to as quasi causality. The fact that this is precisely something that the machine cannot do, because if you are because it has to take into account everything, and we have the capacity to distinguish between the necessary and the contingent. And this is never, ever something that can be done once and for all. In what we were talking about in terms of generic, you have to always assess what are the contingent, what are the necessary points, and therefore that's the indeterminacy a bit, which I think is very difficult to square with the digital computing, no?
And Victoria left, but she put a comment in there where she was referring to Charles Sanders Peirce and what he was calling abduction, which I think is also what Andrej is saying in different terms now. Abduction coming from Peirce, meaning a third way of thinking, which is not deductive or reductive. And recent, let's say, people that appropriate Peirce would go and say that what we qualify as even the highest forms of AI, let's say, I don't know if ChatGPT is one of those, but let's say it is for the sake of the discussion now, what they are at the very best what they're able to do is perform what is called the weak abduction, which is also named as statistical abduction, okay? Which means 12 eggs, 3 of them are rotten, so one assumes that all the rest 9 of them are also rotten. That's abduction, but it's a weak statistical abduction. The strong abduction is one that is not based on statistics. It's not based on a numerical, mathematical analyzing and projecting of data. Let's call them like that. So for me, the question that Lila is her name, right? Or yeah. Anyway, yeah. For me, the question that she's placing in there, the interesting part that one would enter in and try to respond if we had more time, would be the one that she's actually saying that recently computers can respond to problems quickly and automatically. Okay, so it's another one what Andrej was trying to say. The problem is in there for me the very term automatically. Okay, I think what Andrej is trying to say is that when one tries to think abductively, but like not statistically abductively in a way that it's not based on data, one cannot do so automatically. Automation does not have a part in there because it's not a one-to-one relationship where things have to be immediately moved from the one to the other, from the solution to the problem, from the problem to solution. There is an interval in there. And this interval in Bergsonian terms has to do with the cone itself, okay? It needs to be broad enough in the top, where it includes even experiences that are not your own, memories that are not your own, intensities that are not your own, and it ends up with you expressing them, with you being at the point where they are expressed. Things like ChatGPTs or AIs just have a very broad cone. It's so broad, but it doesn't have a finishing point in the end, and it's so broad that it doesn't have any quality, any evaluation of what is to be included in there. Simply put, everything can be included, and everything can automatically be excluded as well and move from one point to the other. That's yeah. Go.
Just mentioned the Moravec paradox is that it's interesting to see that you can teach a computer to play chess, but you can't make it negotiate space as what toddler can do. And this is precisely because it has to figure out. This is what I was referring to, this idea of and one divided by how many. You don't know because you have to. You embodied experience, and this is the apex of the Bergsonian cone, which is at the center of action and indetermination at the same time. Action because it's in constant friction, it's moving around, and therefore it's not completely self-enclosed. It's not a closed system. There's something always. Sieves out things that are at a particular point in time that is not interested in, and this is where the novel. I mean, this is the elbow room that provides for novelty. Without it, it's a closed system which does everything in an incredibly efficient way. But
I think, I mean, I know we're probably running out of time, but I think also it's important within a very strictly architecturally speaking perspective, it's important also, once again, not to get confused in a discussion that does not refer to architectural interests. I know I'm sounding a bit confusing now, but I mean, for me, and we've discussed this with Andrej, ChatGPT, for example, as a recent trend and term, reveals more about certain failures of language. So how language as a system operates, confusingly enough, quite in a closed manner, and therefore can be easily reproduced, even similarly looking like as something very intelligent. But however, if this pertains to language, this does not pertain to experience in a much broader sense. And I would say that architecture does not deal with systems as closed as language or as any other lab looking like fixed, let's say, spatially and temporally condition, but it refers to something that is extremely broad and open. If we can just say that architecture refers to experience in this broad manner, then indeed, a way of thinking that is just able to rearrange stuff of a closed system is not appropriate even to be charming. It's not appropriate even to be charming for architects. I'm not saying that it should be dismissed on the get-go, but I'm saying that one should not, again, architecturally speaking, fall victim of being mesmerized by things that in their own right, their complexity is extremely insignificant and much smaller than the very, very, very broad field of complexity that architecture deals with.
And this is exactly what we meant by the odd two uneven halves, the virtual and the actual. We cannot reduce all of that, wonderful richness to the ontic level of something that is manifest, because only the discrete and manifest and actual can be computed. The virtual cannot be computed. It's not, and this is not a limitation. It's just an ontological.
It's not computational either. A limitation, yeah.
It's a category error to think that we just need more computing power. No, the duration differs from itself, and that's what makes it so both scary but also promising.
We need to wrap things up. I've been fascinated by the discussion about ChatGPT. I've looked at ChatGPT, I've used it and things but I've been more active engaging with diffusion platforms, which operate in a slightly different way. I mean, it's not just text; they link text to images through captions on the web and so on. And what I would say is, and a particular question I'm interested in is the difference between interpolation and extrapolation. And what you can do with Midjourney and DALL-E, more with the Midjourney, certainly the earlier versions, is to, in some ways, by using a prompt and having unlikely terms juxtaposed, is to contaminate things, and therefore to extrapolate and breed and open up possibilities. And I also think there's a slight as assumption a lot of people have that it's simply just retrieving data from the web. It's searching and synthesizing. So often it's actually not directly just reproducing things. But I don't know about ChatGPT, and I also think that you have to maybe incorporate the fact that the human is in the loop and is part of the decision-making process. Therefore, it's one versus the other. It's the human with his cyborgian prosthesis to mention, so it's going to probably coming up next week. So I'm not quite sure it is so simple. But anyway, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've got lots of other questions I would have liked today, but I would like to ask, but I took a back seat just to hear you, because this was a real treat. This was absolutely, and this is an endorsement to go and study in Delft with you guys. I mean, what an incredible.
If I may, just a very last quick point. There is a very thinking that I'm not in agreeable terms on all regards. His name is Alfonso Lingis. He's more focused on language, but he's having a very good point that can be applied to precisely what you were just saying, Neil. It has to do with metaphors. Metaphors can bring things together, strange things together, but they cannot produce the strange. And I think that's where the crucial difference is, also in you saying that humans are part of the loop. With humans as part of the loop, it's not just about bringing strange stuff together. It's about producing the strange, producing the indeterminate, producing the unexpected. And that's a different discussion.
Yeah, I think we are the discriminators in that situation. You're the generator, and we are the discriminators, choosing, selecting what to go with to some extent. But that's a long discussion. This has been absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm kind of thinking that maybe in the future, instead of Deleuze and Guattari, it would be Radman and Kousoulas or something like that. But this collaboration has been so productive, and I look forward to seeing sort of part 2, as it were, next week with Heidi and Robert.
We'll be back for that as well. Yes.
Amazing. Well, I think this is to be continued. I think this is what you've done, is sown the seed or something. I've got to confess that I think Andrej said that he read Deleuze before he read Bergson. I read Deleuze. I haven't read Bergson at all. So I've been here absorbing this, and this is an incredibly stimulating session. And really, we're sharing this all over the world, which is a fantastic thing with Vasco in Bangladesh and people in Indian subcontinent all over the place. So thank you so much, and thank you also to the team behind this, especially Bavaline and the team. A lot of work goes behind all this, and it's great to see that we'll post this, we'll upload it to our library. It's there for everyone to watch for free, and hopefully that itself will be part of another discussion itself. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrej. Thank you. That was fantastic. Wonderful.
Thank you. Have a great night, great evening, great morning, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye bye. Thank you.